It's lovely to be welcoming Tom Sleigh here today. Before I do that, let me just remind you of some upcoming events. On Tuesday, April 12th at 7 p.m, Booker Prize winner Kiran Desai will be joining us for a reading. She'll be here the whole week, but she will be reading here on the 12th at 7 p.m. in this very room, slightly later time than usual. That same week, on April 14th, we will have a panel of South Asian writers featuring Kiran, Amitava Kumar, Uzma Aslam Khan, and Samrat Upadhyay. So mark your calendars, that should also be a very interesting event. 4:30 on the 14th. I suppose my first source of poetry was the twin babble that my twin brother and I spoke when we were babies just learning to talk. Tom Sleigh reveals of his own artistic beginnings in an interview with Allegra Wong from the literary journal Agni. My mother, who has been known to tell a stretcher, as Huck Finn would say, recounts that one morning she came into our bedroom and overheard us in Beckett-like colloquy, speaking the first English words she remembers us saying, not mama or dada, but my twin brother Tim shaking the bars of his crib, calling Dean Martin, while I called back Jerry Lewis. Given this anecdote, it might not surprise anyone to know that Tom's parents were at the time running a drive-in movie theater in a small East Texas town. His mother operated the snack bar while his father worked the projector. Of those early days, he remembers, I always fell asleep just as the movies began at dusk, and the voices coming through the car speakers were like the voices in my dreams, the two intermingling to make a kind of poetry. Especially since I thought the voices in dreams were the voices of dead people, come to tell you things you were forbidden to hear during the day. In the opening poem from his collection, The Chain, a translation of text from a cuneiform tablet in the Louvre, we can hear those voices of the dead loud and clear. In this piece, titled Lamentation on Ur, the speaker laments our country's dead, who melt into earth as grease melts in the sun. Men whose helmets now lie scattered, men annihilated by the double-bladed axe. Ur, as you may know, was the Sumerian city with a recorded history that dates back as far as 3800 BC, and is also considered by many to be Ur-Kasdim, mentioned in the book of Genesis as the birthplace of Abraham or Ibrahim. The city's remains are located today in southern Iraq, a region often referred to, of course, as the cradle of civilization. And it's to Iraq and to other regions of conflict that Tom returns in his most recent collection, Station Z, via a series of poems that also visit Libya, Lebanon, and Somalia, and that chronicle his experience of those places in a language and style that seems to chime with what Robert Pinsky, in his essay The Responsibilities of the Poet, describes as an answering of the received cultural imagination with something utterly different. In the poems of Station Z, we're dared to stare down the cyclops eye of an AK-47 at a boy with trousers rolled above his ankles, and to enter the room where, when the soldiers lie down on mats, their faces slacken and sleep runs like a hand over their skinny bodies. Rather than giving us the death toll numbers of the news report or the slippery jargon and jingoism of the government briefing, we are given the very particularized human weight and cost of armed conflict and what grows out of armed conflict. In these poems, a lament on Ur opens into a lament for a world in which you can let yourself go in so many ways. The bomb pack strapped to your waist and detonated by pushing send on your cell phone, and in which the eternal aesthete is engaged not in the pursuit of the holy, the mystical, or whatever you want to call it, but of that moment when the splintering of light passing through tent mesh awakens him to the unambivalent hate he's always craved. In one of the book's longer sequences, a mixture of poetry and reflective prose titled homage to Basho, we meet Miriam, a student in a workshop Tom taught in Iraq, reading a poem about her brother, bending down to kiss her gently on the cheek and ask her if she wanted anything special from the market before he goes off to enact a suicide bombing. His gentleness and the violence of his final act resisted my attempts to explain or understand, Tom reflects, before moving on to think about former Secretary of State Donald Rumsfeld's Parade of Horribles, a declassified memo that lists the consequences of the US-led invasion of Iraq as a 4th of July parade of grotesques, then delivering a sestina about the alleged abuse of detainees at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, and then returning to Baghdad to air a rage about the relentlessness of the killing, the zealotry that could inspire it, the religious mania that seemed to brutalize people into killing other ordinary Iraqis who most likely weren't particularly religious, except as formal, societal, or familial instinct, and who had no doctrinal grudge against anyone. Surely this is the protest that Tom lists among his future plans in that 2003 Agni piece. Surely this is that real anti-war work he speaks of there. But it would be wrong to note Tom's recent work solely for its chronicling of these dark and dangerous days, its humane and humble and necessary acts of contemporary witness. Related to those impulses, but drawn from different areas, we also encounter in Station Z a consideration of the American century via poems that recall what it was like to grow up in the Cold War, to labor in the California heat for a boss whose attitude to his customers was screw 'em out of this, screw 'em out of that, or to encounter a long-dead aunt who lived in a Newark apartment complex so notorious for heroin that one day when I visited her, she talked that way that makes you wonder how a woman who was a social worker, a Eugene Debs socialist, could become so vicious in her mind. We also encounter an homage to the French-Algerian soccer player Zinedine Zidane, a letter to the poet's twin long after those days of yelling Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis from crib to crib, and a poem in memory of the late Seamus Heaney in which we're shown a book left out by the vacant deck chair, fluttering its pages, signalling to the reader somewhere out of sight to come back, and start the book over. There's no question that Station Z is a book that demands such a response, and that Tom Sleigh's poetry, described by Heaney himself as hard-earned and well-founded, is a poetry more necessary to us now than ever. I hope my poems swim down as far as they can stick their heads in the muck, open their eyes and take a good look around, Tom says in that same Agni interview, and these are the poems that just do that, or that do just that. Tom Sleigh is a poet, playwright, essayist, translator, and journalist, and the director of the Graduate Creative Writing Program at Hunter College in New York City. His poems have appeared in The New Yorker, the best of the best American poetry and poetry, and have earned him accolades including the Kingsley Tufts Award and the Poetry Society of America Shelley Memorial Award. His work has been described by Philip Labine as pushing into greatness, while David Wojan tells us that among American poets of his generation, there is no one better. It's an honor and a pleasure to welcome him to Trinity College. Please put your hands together and do the same.
Hello. I'm having deja vu all over again. I want to thank Kieran for the beautiful introduction. When you run around like this and give readings, sometimes you're introduced and sometimes you're introduced. So that was one of those. Meant a lot to me. So I'm going to read about 35 minutes, and I have a timer, so you needn't worry. And then, I know what the most important thing at a reading is, how long it lasts. So if you have questions at the end, I'm happy to try to answer them. And why don't we begin? I think I may as well start with, I think I'll start about a poem about my twin brother, since Kieran mentioned it. And one of the things we were talking about in the class today was somebody asked me that since I've written about drugs, could I talk about that? And so I said, sure. So we talked about that. So I'll read this poem for the students. And, in the poem it talks about shooting dope. That's one of the things it talks about. It's called The Twins. You know those twins hanging on the corner? They look like me and my twin brother when we were younger, in our 20s. The paler one like me, sickly, more uptight, but weirdly aristocratic. More distant than the one like you, Tim, who, if you were him, would put his arm around me with that casualness and gentleness I've always craved between us, which we nearly lost in our 20s, but got back in our 50s. Now that death's in my face, when I look at it, at just the right angle. Then your smile's so open, Tim, that we go back even further, to when we were boys listening on the stairs to our older brother telling us about girls, what you could do with them, what they'd do with you. Not much like our board games when all we'd think about was rolling the dice and moving the metal dog or battleship round and round the squares, counting out loud, intent on winning. But these past few days, your eyes keep confronting me in the mirror, your glance full of a goofball happiness. And the wreath of poppies around your head grazes my forehead too. And like the dope I used to shoot, the clear dose in the syringe lets me down into my body like I'm deep inside your body. The two of us together, fed by the same blood, waking, sleeping, nestled next to each other, thumbs in our mouths. But it only lasts a little while, this feeling of me inside you, inside that liquid warmth up the back of my neck and down toward my cock, the high moving at its own sweet will. Tim, I'll only belong to you forever when the other brother, the pale and stern and faceless one, who holds the needle still when I slide it into the vein and smiles back my smile. I'll only belong to him too when he, in some parody of an old rocker in a crowd of old rockers holding up lit cigarette lighters, snaps shut that flickering. Oh, sure, to sleep is good. To die is even better. But the best is never to have been born. Well, I guess I made it out of the womb, eh? I think I'll read another poem that Kieran mentioned. It's the poem about Zinedine Zidane. I don't know if we have any soccer fans here. I know we have one. Yeah, right there. Okay. Everybody remember the World Cup? Yeah. Anyway, there was a very famous headbutting episode in which Zidane apparently, he's an ethnic Algerian playing for the French team, and apparently one of the Italian players insulted his ethnic origin as well as his sister. So he headbutted him. And this poem takes place in Lebanon, where I was doing some journalism, and the World Cup was on, and it was quite an astounding experience to be in Beirut at that time. And, they had huge satellite hookups in every street all over the city. And just off the coast of Beirut, there's the Pigeon Rocks, and they're filthy, but people go swimming there anyway. And so I, in a moment of insanity, decided I would go swimming there, and nearly drowned. But, I didn't. So one of the things that I think the poem is about, too, is, the idea of sport as a kind of this beautiful dream of world humanism in which everybody comes together. I guess that's one of the things the poem talks about and would like to believe, but doesn't, I guess, in the end. Homage to Zidane. In all the cafes on the seafront, whatever could be seen kept exploding in riots of blue, red, green. Horns everywhere hooting for the ball, soaring toward the net. Slicks of trash and plastic glinting from the waves. The world was in a fever to see the perfect goal. The giant screens on every corner, loud with the locust thrum of satellite hookups. Between two limestone cliffs, I plunged into the filth, sucked a mouthful of oil, and set out swimming hard to where I heard rising voices shouting in Arabic, "Score, score." A big wave swept me under, another and another, until I shot out of the water that gleamed like a forehead budding mine. Expert but without malice, threatening to drag me down until I slid out on the rocks. I shivered and wanted to live in the clear light of the announcers' voices, echoing in different languages, weaving a net so fine the sun could pass through it. Yeah, you could see in instant replay the ball caught and caught and caught, and not one stitch of that fabric going taut. Here's another poem about sport. It's about football. I played high school football. I'm still recovering. You can see that. I both loved high school football and I hated high school football. I loved running into people and I hated running into people. And I remember once we did a drill in which my twin brother and I, who were both linemen, were asked to get in front of the rest of the team. And he was called Timmy and I was Tommy. And then the coach said, "All right, Timmy and Tommy, go at it." So Timmy and Tommy started smashing into each other. This was supposed to be a lesson in aggression and all the rest of it. And I confess I did enjoy smashing into my twin brother. I think he enjoyed smashing into me for a while. But this went on for a long time. 3 minutes smashing into somebody is a long time. And they were both exhausted by it. It was a strange experience. And the only other thing you need to know about the poem is that there was an old talk show radio host. People may know him in Southern Cal, named Joe Pine. Nobody remembers Joe Pine. Anyway, Joe Pine was one of the original talk show hosts, and his specialty was to insult people. And he once had Frank Zappa on, and they had this strange exchange. And the last thing you need to know is that Joe Pine, he had a wooden leg. Self-portrait with shoulder pads. Brother fighting brother, and the loser driven out. My eyes were on Tim's eyes, off someplace, gone from his body, while under his jersey the shoulder pads gleam brighter. Masculine yoke we both labor under, determined not to get knocked flat. Smashing and smashing into each other, helmets blankly ringing to the whole team screaming in time to the drill, Timmy hit Tommy, Tommy hit Timmy, until, exhausted, we fall to our knees, and still coach refuses to blow the whistle, so that we, on our knees, keep ramming into each other. Implacable, servile, our hearts too violent not to play inside the rules. How we envied the hippies on the Joe Pine show. Pine sneering to Frank Zappa, "So, I guess your long hair makes you a woman." Zappa shooting back, "I guess your wooden leg makes you a table." White as calcium, white as moons brought down into swamp water, white as a cataract on a blind eye, the pads fuse onto shoulder bones to make us walk that athletic walk of power and glory and terror of shame. So Tommy hitting Timmy and Timmy hitting Tommy takes over mind and body in the zone until coach blows the whistle and we get up off our knees and turn to avoid each other's faces. Years later, brought down by gun flash insights of assassination and business frowns of gangbangers dividing up junk, while police held the line in riot masks and shields, I prayed for the cup to pass. But either way, I was an ass and had to carry my ass's load as far as an ass could. I think I'll read that poem about my boss, Bob Harrington, the swimming pool guy. One of the interesting things about, I used to work swimming pool construction, and I was reading in a history of Los Angeles that during the war, there were three great European geniuses who left Europe to come to America to get away from the war, and it was Stravinsky, it was Thomas Mann, and it was Schoenberg, the composer. And I read that all three of them were interested in getting swimming pools. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because my father is over there fighting the war and they're over here thinking about swimming pools. I thought, well, that's okay. It's called the craze. There was a certain point in which everybody wanted a swimming pool. What could I say, a laborer, to the overseas geniuses? That my father fought their war against the Japanese? That the leisure class I served, I aspired to? So I could join the high G of the cello floating off, slowly vanishing in a pianissimo fermata. Then nothing more, silence and night. But this was California, and soon the heat pump and water filler would strain the water to such a blueness and temperature that acid-washed LA would go swimming night and day. The blue havens built by Alambristas, union bricklayers, unskilled juvies, teaching me the Faustian accounting of my employer. Bob, just call me a genius Harrington. Screw 'em out of this, screw 'em out of that, but sweep up your mess and you'll get away with murder. Sucking up the slurry of cement and sand, the hose pulsed in the pit of the parvenu, the ingenue, the Hollywood producers and Van Nuys GM bosses whose assembly line crews riveted my beat-up Firebird's body. Wolfman Jack's XERB, taking another little piece of my heart now, baby, as I sprayed gunite on rebar ribs and the air compressor pounded like the other Firebird. Stravinsky, taking his temperature in West Hollywood. Schoenberg, watering his lawn in Brentwood. Mon, perched above the waves in Pacific Palisades, had also perused catalogs weighing concrete versus vinyl as blast caps detonated in holes the Demis drilled, and ash sifted down over my face and shoulders to post-war 12-tone, assaulting my ears. But while I and my transistor radio worked 10-hour days, my father dreamt our own little South Seas grotto. Every weekend, we rose to the promise of chlorination as he and us boys dug trenches for our water lines, hacked away the hillside to make our ice plant grow, and rented the monster backhoe, digging out the pool pit to rim it with lavastone against the mud. My father waved the baton of his shovel to light the fuse to the cord of dynamited stone. The cloud of our need went up all over California and rang in overtones all through me. I think I'll read an excerpt from that long poem that Kieran mentioned. The poem's called Homage to Basho, and the poem came out of a trip that I took under the aegis of University of Iowa International Writing Program. I went with Christopher Merrill, who heads it, and we basically went to Iraq just before the country fell apart, before ISIS really became a firmly established presence in the country. And we basically traveled all over the country. We were in Kurdistan, we were down in Basra, we were in Beirut. And we were there to meet with college students and professors and Iraqi writers. And, it was very dangerous to move around. So wherever we went, we were always in body armor and all that kind of thing. And one of the exercises that we did, which Kieran mentioned, was in one particular workshop, we asked the students to simply do this very simple exercise in which they thought back to their childhoods. And we wanted them to write, I remember, I remember, I remember, for each one of their memories. And then at a certain point, we asked them to change that. And we said, why don't you change I remember to I don't want to remember? And everything changed. Because it was a whole generation that has grown up knowing nothing but war, either between Iran and Iraq, with the United States, and then in a certain sense with each other. I don't look very military, and I'm not. And I think this first section will prove that. It's interesting to see Brian Williams back on television. Anyway, I'm not Brian Williams. This poem moves back and forth between poetry and prose, which is what that's what the 17th century Japanese poet Basho did. He wrote travelogues, basically punctuated by poems. This is what this is. I prove myself to be inept, at putting on my bulletproof vest, attaching this to that in all the wrong places, before figuring out how to Velcro the waist panels tightly around my stomach so that they were under the vest, not over it, and adjusting and readjusting the shoulder straps to make sure they were tight. I didn't look very military. In fact, I looked like I was wearing a bib, a sort of Rambo Jr. Now that I was strapped into my vest, it felt fairly lightweight, around 8 pounds. Thick enough, according to the specs, to give reasonable protection against handguns. But when you consider that a bullet fired from a military-style weapon is the equivalent of a 5-pound sledgehammer smashing into you at 45 miles per hour, serious bruising and broken ribs are pretty much guaranteed. I put on my helmet and snapped the chin snap fast, but I had to keep pushing it back from sliding down over my eyes. Rather than protected, I looked and felt like an overgrown infant. In front of our armored vehicle, a Chevy Suburban SUV reinforced with steel plating, a beefy but terminally polite security contractor gave us a briefing. Once you're inside the vehicle, please stay away from the doors. We'll let you in and out. If we take fire, or if I give you the signal to get down, I'd appreciate it if you could get on the bottom of the vehicle. I'll climb in back with you and cover you. Once we get to our destination, you can leave your armor and helmets in the vehicle. Then we'll open the doors and we'll proceed single file to our destination. Everything clear? Lamentation on Ur, from a Sumerian spell, 2000 BC. Like molten bronze and iron, shed blood pools. Our country's dead melt into the earth as grease melts in the sun. Men whose helmets now lie scattered. Men annihilated by the double-bladed axe. Heavy beyond help, they lie still as a gazelle exhausted in a trap, muzzle in the dust. In home after home, empty doorways frame the absence of mothers and fathers who vanished in the flames remorselessly spreading, claiming even frightened children who lay quiet in their mother's arms, now born into oblivion, like swimmers swept out to sea by the surging current. May the great barred gate of blackest night again swing shut on silent hinges, destroyed in its turn. May this disaster, too, be torn out of mind. In one of our workshops, a young woman wearing a black and white headscarf with a round face and large black eyes, and with just a hint of mascara on the lashes, stood up to read her poem. Her name was Miriam, and she stood very straight in front of her classmates and read to us with a quiet, unself-conscious dignity. Her pronunciation was excellent, so I have a good memory of what she wrote. She said that she was woken near dawn by her older brother in her bedroom, who had bent down to gently kiss her on the cheek and to ask her if she wanted anything special in the market. And when she looked up at him to tell him no, he said to her very gently that this would be the last time she'd be seeing him. But she was so sleepy, she didn't quite take in what he meant, and a moment later, he was gone. Later that morning, she wrote, she was in the kitchen having breakfast with her mother. And then their neighbor came in and gave them the news. She wrote that as she heard the news, she felt herself get smaller and disappear. She had no hands, no face, no body to feel with. There was no kitchen, no mother, no her. The neighbor, she wrote, told them about the car accident. She wrote how she remembers her brother's words coming back to her, how gentle he was when he kissed her on the cheek, how he would always bring her special things from the market. And then she sat down, seeming completely self-possessed, except for the sadness that had come into her voice and hung now in the room. No one said anything for a while, is what she hadn't said. Didn't need to say, since everyone in her generation already understood. Resonated for a few moments. Chris and I looked at each other, but were slower in grasping what it was she'd left out. And then it dawned on us too. Her brother had been a suicide bomber and blown himself up in the car. The chopper's sides were open to the night air, and I instinctively shoved myself back on the bench as far as I could get. Not very far, it turned out, certainly not far enough to quell my unease about hurtling through the air with no door in front of me. The contractor gave me thumbs up, and I at least knew enough to give thumbs up back, and then the chopper blades accelerated faster and louder. He slid the lenses of his night vision goggles past the lip of his helmet and down over his eyes to keep watch for snipers on the ground, and then we slowly ascended, the nose of the chopper dipping slightly as the tail lifted, and we soared straight up until the pilot adjusted the pitch of the rotors, and we shot ahead, eventually climbing to about 100 feet over the city. Everything was dark down below for the first quarter mile, and then we were crossing over Baghdad, the lights of the cars on the road flickering softly, house lights shining in the windows. The pilot occasionally flicked a switch on the instrument panel, and then, as we rose higher and the night air got very cold, the contractor slid the Lexan glass doors closed on the passenger part of the tiny cabin. The chopper shimmied back and forth in the light wind, soft buffets, almost the way a child might pet a cat on the head. Just above the pilot's helmet, silhouetted against the curved glass of the windshield, shimmered another little galaxy. Switches glowing in the darkness, an overhead instrument panel lit up the pilot's hand as he leisurely lifted his arm to switch something off or on. For a moment, I had the reverie of myself as a child, looking up at day-glow stars stuck to the ceiling over my bed. A memory I knew to be false, since I'm way too old for such things to have existed when I was a kid. Nor were my parents the type to indulge me with day-glow stars. I knew, even as I took pleasure in it, that my fantasy was out of sync with the reality on the ground, not to mention the contractor hunching forward, his gun in his lap, intently scanning the darkness below. At least the contractor had his orders and his night vision goggles. What I had to go on was the drone of helicopter noise, its surgical detachment from the neighborhood alleys and streets, and the way my own hypervigilant senses magnified and crystallized the light and dark flow of the city beneath me. One of Saddam's former palaces, encircled by a moat that testified to the dead dictator's love of water, glowed dimly below us, looking like an Arabian Nights fantasy in bad taste, and reputed to have a torture chamber in the basement. Aloft in the chopper and looking down, I found and continue to find it hard to know what tone to take when the truth is both atrocious and banal. And if you were on the ground looking up. In an oral history of the Iraq War, I'd come across this account of a pregnant woman, Rana Abdul Mahdi, who lives in Sadr City. Quote, I saw a helicopter floating very high in the air away from me, and I watched as it fired a rocket toward me and my little sister, Zara. She was 8. I felt heat all over my body, and then I was on the ground as the street filled with smoke. There were bodies all around me, and I saw my sister with all her insides spilling out her front. She was reaching for me, motioning with her hand for me to come and help. I saw my left foot was gone. It was sitting there in the street, a little ways from me. Before rain. Whatever you do, there are rockets falling, and after the rockets, smoke climbing up through walls that are exploding. Trees grow up where there once were people. Weeds take over beds of lettuces and cuddled flowers. Uprearing molehills unpopulate the fields. The bricked-in hours of the human have all been knocked down. No one lingers at lipstick counters. No one stares into a screen to escape the digital mayhem of heroes hurtling over the heads of monsters. The old bones on the mountain that stand upright and shake when winds blow up from the shore, old bones that shake when the winds roar, now dangle in the void of an unknown dimension. Forget all this, says Earth to the stars. And then I'll finish with 2 poems. And I'm going to read this one for Kiara. Both of us were friends of Phil Levine, and shortly before Phil died, he gave me a call and asked me to come out and see him, and so I did. And you know how it is when you're seeing a friend for the last time, there's all this kind of intensity of emotion in the room. But one thing about Phil, he was immensely funny, totally ironic at all times. And, first time you say, I love you, and he says, I love you. And you say, I love you, and he says, I love you. But the third time he says, you know what, let's not use that word. The L word's been used too much. And so I thought, yeah, that makes sense. And the only other thing about the poem that you need to know, I remember when I met Phil about, when I was a pup, nearly 30 years ago. We had met for the very first time. We were talking about a poem by Philip Larkin, one of Phil's favorite poets. And we were talking about this particular poem called At Grass, which is about retired racehorses. And the line that he particularly loved when we were discussing goes, till wind distresses tail and mane. And Phil looked at me and he says, what do you think of that line? I thought, great line, man. And then and said, well, don't you like the pun on that word distress? I say, oh yeah, great, yeah. So Vince Hill said, like distress isn't to agitate. And he said, and of course you know that racehorses have their tails and manes braided before they run. So therefore, if the manes and the tails are distressed and distressed, he said, you knew that, right? I said, oh yeah, I knew that. So the last thing you need to know is Phil had a heart arrhythmia his whole life long, which never really bothered him. For Phil, he sits reading under his desk lamp. He loves how wind distresses tail and mane. He likes the rhymes, internal and irregular, how people from the old days walk in and out of the poem, how the father who dies in one stanza can rise in another, how, despite the drought, the rain keeps falling in 14 lines. His rumpled bed is never not specific as the dent his head leaves in the pillow. He rubs his hand across his jaw, unshaven. His touch on the back of your wrist is delicate and urgent. When you help him up from bed, he isn't shy about holding on. When he lies back down, he grips his water bottle and won't let go. Smiling says, let's not use that word. It's been used 10,876 times. He shrugs off the weepers, the brotherly lovers, the sour preachers turning purple and blue in their dandruff-sprinkled robes. Out in his backyard in Fresno, the oranges are ripening. At his window in Brooklyn, the plane trees, stripped bare of leaves, click softly in the breeze. Him in his undershirt, in his tweed jacket, in sweatpants, watching Norman Szymanski clean and jerk. Now he's throwing rocks on the bridle path. He's turning into a fox. The brush of his tail mocks the pack. He leaps clear of his own tracks, doubles back, loses the lords and ladies' riding. Now he's preaching to rats, showing them pages in holy books, money books, books of the entitled that are good to eat and chew right down. But all alone in his study with ice and sun, he scrawls with his fountain pen, crosses it all out, starts again. And this time rising up are the sheared away walls of an abandoned high school, a stack of rusted axles, a diner where nobody talks openly of love, but where ketchup and mockery are served up with the coffee, and his heart, arrhythmic, pulses out of sync, all on its own. And I'll finish with another elegy for a poet. That's Seamus Heaney, who is also a friend of ours. And this poem came about the day Seamus died. I was walking around Brooklyn, and I walked by a tea shop. And there, in the tea shop window, was a old brown fedora. Which, see, we're done. Which looked exactly like Seamus's old brown fedora. And then there was a little poem set up on a tea tin, and it was one of Seamus's. And I went in and I said to the guy, "This looks like Seamus's hat." He said, "Well, that's because it is Seamus's hat." And he had given Seamus a ride to a reading 20 years ago, and Seamus had left the hat in the back seat, and he never had figured out how to return it. So there it was. Called Valediction, in memoriam Seamus Heaney. The backyard lives of cat and bird, and the way leaves give themselves away this instant to the all but no breeze, creeping across the silver-painted roof where clouds reflected, past dark, then bright, of above a book left out by the vacant deck chair, fluttering its pages, signaling to the reader somewhere out of sight to come back, and start the book over. This all arrives without a valediction, forbidding anything. Just the sense of seeing something or someone for the last time. The poet's faded fedora in a tea store window, haunting this October's primary blues, bringing back mid-May and the missing mate of the nightingale singing day long and night late. Thank you. And if anyone has any questions, Kieran said you might have questions, so fire away if you wish. Yeah.
How long do you think it took you to find your voice?
That's an interesting question, and I'll tell you my answer to that is I don't ever want to find it. I understand when people say they want to find their voice, and I get that. But, for me, it's never been that way. It's always like, I don't want to know what my own voice is, because I'm afraid then that I'll just climb into my coffin at that point, and, subjects will come along, and I will treat them with my voice. And I don't really, what I'm interested in is trying to find a voice for each individual poem. I think that's a much more interesting way to think about it, because then you're not locked into some idea of your signature style. I don't ever want to have a signature style. I once talked to a famous poet, and he once said to me something like, well, when I threw off the influence of modernist X, that's when I found my voice. And you just had to say, yeah, you did. All your poems are just alike from that time on. So that would be my answer to that. Yeah.
So, since you have been a poet, has your style of delivering poems and readings changed throughout your career?
I have a horror of hearing myself recorded. Actually, I was talking about this with Kieran. I was doing some program for radio, and there were various reasons why I couldn't stand listening to it. So I wouldn't know. Honestly, I just don't. I imagine, you get older. One thing I do think that has changed from when I was younger is I used to be very proud of my formal accomplishment. And I used to say stupid shit like, and now I shall read you a sonnet. And everybody was supposed to go, ooh, a sonnet. And then I suddenly realized, it would be a lot better to write a really good poem that just happened to be a sonnet than a really good sonnet that's just a shit poem. So, I don't do that anymore. There's all kinds of gauche, stupid stuff you do when you're young, and probably stupid stuff I do when I'm old, but I think I do less stupid stuff when I'm old. Also, I'm not really interested in being entertaining. I want people to listen, but I don't want to be an entertainer. If you want to be entertained, I don't know. 30 Rock does it better. You know? So, yeah, I don't think poets are entertainers. I don't think they should be. I don't think they should aspire to that. You know, I don't think any literary artist should aspire to that. Honestly, I swear to God, you know, one of my favorite readings I ever heard was given by the poet Allan Dugan. And Allan was like the most incredible Brooklyn accent you can ever imagine. And when I'd read his poems on a page, they had big, you know, there were a lot of O sounds in the poem. And, it, you know, I thought, oh, this will sound like Tennyson, no more will we roam, we roam, we roam. And actually, when Allan did his own poems, you know, he flattened the O's out so they were like ah sounds. And it was incredibly ugly. And I learned so much about the poem by hearing Allan read it. So, of course, he was just a consummate master with Latin sources and all that. But really, it was all about, you know, that kind of local, regional way he talked. And I thought, you know, if an actor read this poem, nothing against actors now, but he'd ruin it, or she would ruin it. You know, I often listen to. There was a certain point. Anyway, I'm going to stop. Or I'm, you know, now I'm getting into indiscreet moments where I, you know. Anyway, I don't think you should ham it up. You know what I mean? You don't need a lot of gestures, and you're not an actor on selected shorts. You're not at the Moth. You know, you're there to serve the work. You know, you want. I mean, I try to connect as much as I possibly can with the emotion in the poem so that it's fresh for me. And if I can do that, if I can get inside it, then I feel like I've read well. If I can't do that, then it didn't matter to me. So, you know, that's basically my stake. And I'm trying to serve the work, you know, in whatever way I can. Yeah.
I don't know if this is too personal, but what does your twin brother do now, and like what is your relationship?
Oh, my twin brother. Well, he's an amazing. He is. He's an amazing. I mean, I'll tell you, my twin brother. He became a musician. You see, both of us started out as musicians, and we played in a soul band. You know, I did the Dutlet Duts. You know, we did the figures, the horn figures. We played every USO club in San Diego, and we did, you know, MCRD and the Marine Corps Recruit Deck Bow, and you know, I mean, you know, the Midnight Hour, you know, soul music. You know, we were big into it. Yeah, little white boys playing soul music. Anyway, we loved it. We had a good time, and we had a really wonderful band. You know, so he continued to play. He continued to play, and he had quite a career actually as a professional musician. I mean, he played all over. He played the studios in Los Angeles, and then he also. You know, every time Frankie Valli, remember Frankie Valli? Yeah, Big Girls Don't Cry, and then Fame and all that. Every time Frankie would come to L.A., I call him Frankie, but, you know, because everybody called him Frankie. I mean, and he was that kind of a guy. He was a super nice guy. I mean, I met him after he came off heroin. He would, you know, he'd changed. And he was very nice. I mean, I met a lot of people in the music business through my brother. A lot of them were just dickhead assholes. Super, like, you know, total egotistical maniacs and boring beyond belief. You know, and then, you know, Tim ended up in Vegas playing, you know, show tunes, which he didn't really like much. Because, you know, the dynamics were all over the place. You're playing, you know, I Did It My Way, Triple Forte. And so basically, he now lives in Albuquerque, and, you know, he's an occupational therapist. And he gigs all over the Southwest with his band. He's just a wonderful, wonderful reed player. It's fantastic. So yeah, you know, he plays, and he, you know, made some albums, and you know, I mean, I envy him. You know, I mean, that was my real first love. I played cornet. I wanted to be, you know, Nat Adderley, you know, or Cannonball Adderley, and Nat Adderley, and you know, Mercy, Mercy, Mercy. You know, anyway, that's what he's doing.
And are you close?
Yeah, we are. I mean, you know, yeah, we're close. We took a hike we went to England to take a hike. We hadn't been in the same room in years and years and years, and I thought that was going to be really weird. But we stayed in the same room, and then we would hike for 12 miles. And if you have any anxiety over how it was going to go, believe me, after the 6th or 7th mile, you don't have any anxiety. You hurt every part of your body. I mean, really, middle age and hiking, plus masochism equals a really good time. So, anyway. But there we were in the same room, and I thought, oh, this is going to be a little awkward, but it wasn't. It was just like sharing a room together again. All the stinks and complete animal familiarity. Lovely, really. Yeah. Anybody else? Oh boy, I guess I really probably did it with the animal familiarity.
We've time for one more question if somebody wants to ask one last question. That's always the point where we don't get a last question, is when I ask for a last question.
Well, thanks very much, everybody. I appreciate it.